When I try to trace where everything truly began, my mind doesn't go to the day I met him. It doesn't go to the first kiss, or the first argument, or even the first time I realized something was wrong. It goes to a quieter moment, a moment so ordinary that I almost missed it. The moment I understood that I was already changing myself to fit into something I didn't yet know how to escape. I was 23, convinced I had life figured out. I told people I was independent, that I didn't believe in romantic illusions, that love was mostly a story people told themselves to feel less alone. I said it confidently, like a shield. And for a while it worked. I lived alone, paid my own bills, moved through the city with the certainty of someone who believed freedom meant never needing anyone too much. I met him during a period when my life felt strangely suspended. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't fulfilled either. I worked late hours, surrounded by people who talked endlessly about ambition, money, and appearances. Everything revolved around looking successful, looking desirable, looking untouchable. Vulnerability was something we joked about, never something we practiced. He didn't stand out immediately. That's what surprises me now. He wasn't loud or particularly charming in an obvious way. What drew me in was his attention. The way he listened without interrupting. The way he looked at me like he was trying to understand something beneath the words I was saying. It made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I was craving. At first, it was harmless. Conversations that lingered longer than they needed to. Messages that crossed the line between casual and intentional. He asked questions no one else bothered to ask. About my past. About why I avoided talking about my family. About what I wanted, not just what I was doing. I told myself it was flattering. I told myself I was still in control. The relationship escalated quickly but quietly. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden promises, just a steady narrowing of my world. I started rearranging my schedule to make room for him, cancelling plans, answering messages faster than I meant to, feeling uneasy when I didn't hear from him for too long. That was the first red flag, not something he did, but something I felt. He was intense in subtle ways. He remembered everything I said, but used it selectively. He praised me for my independence, then questioned it. He admired my strength, then hinted that it made me difficult to love. The compliments and the criticisms were wrapped in the same tone, making it hard to tell where admiration ended and control began. I didn't see it as manipulation, I saw it as depth. Arguments didn't explode, they simmered. He rarely raised his voice, instead he withdrew. Silence became his weapon, and I became obsessed with filling it, explaining myself, justifying choices I'd never questioned before, apologizing for things I didn't fully understand. Somewhere along the way, passion turned into volatility. High moments were intoxicating. When things were good, they felt euphoric, almost unreal. When they weren't, the lows were suffocating. I started measuring my days by his mood, my worth by his attention. Around that time, money began to enter the conversation in strange ways. Not directly, not crudely, more like suggestions. Comments about how easy life could be if I played my cards right. Observations about the kind of men who were willing to pay for discretion, for companionship, for the illusion of intimacy without complications. At first, I laughed it off. I told myself he was joking, that he didn't mean anything by it. But the idea lingered. I was already living on the edge of a world where appearances mattered more than reality, where people rented luxury they couldn't afford and sold versions of themselves carefully curated for others. The concept of using my presence, my time, my attention, as currency didn't feel as foreign as I wanted it to. He never pushed outright. He framed it as empowerment, choice, control. He told me I was wasting my potential by tying myself to conventional limitations. He spoke about independence like it was something I could finally achieve, if only I stopped pretending morality was protecting me. What scared me most wasn't the suggestion itself. It was how easily part of me agreed. I told myself I would never cross certain lines, that I would remain detached, that whatever I did would be on my terms. I convinced myself that emotional distance was a skill I already possessed. That was another lie. As the relationship grew more chaotic, my sense of self became increasingly fragmented. I started hiding parts of my life from people who loved me. I became defensive, secretive, quick to anger when questioned. I told myself no one understood the complexity of what I was navigating. In truth, I didn't want to be understood. I wanted to avoid judgment. The dynamic between us became addictive. Conflict followed by reconciliation. Distance followed by intensity. Every time I thought I was ready to leave, he pulled me back with just enough tenderness to make me doubt myself. By the time I realized I was in a toxic cycle, I was already deeply invested. Emotionally, psychologically, and soon in ways I never imagined I would be. Looking back now, I see how slowly the lines blurred, how carefully my boundaries were tested, then redrawn, how my silence became consent and my confusion became compliance. At the time, I told myself I was surviving, that I was adapting to a harsh reality, that I was stronger than this situation. I didn't yet understand that survival, when prolonged, can start to look a lot like surrender. And that was only the beginning. I wish I could say I noticed the moment I stopped recognizing myself. But it didn't happen like that. There was no single breaking point, no clear before and after. It was gradual, subtle, like watching a photograph fade without realizing it's losing its color. The more unstable the relationship became, the more I clung to it. That's the part that still confuses people when I try to explain it. They ask why I stayed, why I didn't walk away the first time things felt wrong. They assume fear, or weakness, or low self-esteem. The truth was more complicated. He made me feel exceptional and disposable at the same time, like I was chosen, but only temporarily. Like my value depended on how well I performed the version of myself he wanted in that moment. I was either intoxicating or disappointing. There was rarely anything in between. I learned to read him quickly, to anticipate shifts in his mood, to sense when he was about to withdraw, when he was about to become affectionate again. That skill made me feel powerful, even as it trapped me deeper inside the dynamic. Around this time, my life outside of him began to shrink. Friends noticed, but I brushed them off. I told them I was busy, focused, growing. I used ambition as an excuse because it sounded respectable. In reality, I was isolating myself. The lifestyle he kept introducing me to felt glamorous on the surface. Expensive dinners, private spaces, conversations about influence and leverage. Everything was framed as strategy, as knowing how to move through the world without being naive. He spoke about people like assets and situations like opportunities. I told myself I was just observing. Then I started participating. It wasn't sudden. It never is. It began with favors, with being present, with listening, smiling, adapting. I learned how valuable discretion could be, how easily attention could be monetized without ever being named as such. He always reminded me that nothing was forced, that every choice was mine, that empowerment meant understanding how the game was played. I ignored the fact that the rules were never truly mine. Emotionally, I was unraveling. The highs still felt euphoric, but the lows were darker now, more destabilizing. I questioned myself constantly, my instincts, my morals, my memories. If I felt uncomfortable, he framed it as fear of growth. If I hesitated, he called it wasted potential. I started doubting my own reactions, telling myself I was being dramatic, sensitive, unreasonable. Gaslighting doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it's something you learn to do to yourself. There were nights when I went home feeling hollow, staring at my reflection and barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. I felt older than I was, harder, more guarded. I told myself that was strength. Deep down, I knew it was erosion. I crossed lines I once swore I never would. Not because I was reckless, but because I was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of resisting something that had already reshaped my sense of right and wrong. Each compromise made the next one easier. I told myself I could stop at any time, that I was still in control. But control is an illusion when your choices are driven by the need to maintain approval, stability, or affection at any cost. The relationship became more volatile as I became more compliant. Arguments grew sharper, his affection became conditional. I found myself constantly trying to earn moments of peace, moments of warmth, moments where I felt like I mattered again. I was no longer asking whether this was healthy, I was asking how to survive it. Looking back, I see how perfectly the environment supported the transformation. A world that rewarded performance over authenticity, a relationship that thrived on imbalance, a version of myself that believed strength meant enduring anything without complaint. I didn't yet understand the price I was paying, but I was about to. Because once you start living a life built on adaptation instead of truth, something always demands to be exposed, and when it does, it never asks permission. The first real consequence didn't come as punishment, it came as distance. A subtle shift in how people treated me, how conversations ended sooner than they used to, how invitations stopped arriving without explanation. At first, I blamed timing, work, different priorities. It took me longer to admit that I had become difficult to reach, emotionally unavailable even when I was physically present. My world had narrowed to him and the version of life he kept reinforcing. Everything else felt secondary, optional, replaceable. I started lying without preparation. Not elaborate lies, just small adjustments, omissions, strategic silences. I told myself everyone did it. That honesty was overrated in a world built on appearances. Each time I chose not to explain myself, it felt easier, cleaner, less risky. He encouraged that detachment. Not directly, not with commands, with praise. He admired how composed I was, how little I needed from others, how well I handled complexity. He called it maturity, intelligence, adaptability. I internalized those words until they became a justification for almost anything. There were moments when I sensed the imbalance clearly, when I noticed how little he revealed compared to how much he knew about me, how my vulnerabilities were treated as leverage, not intimacy. But every time doubt surfaced, it was quickly reframed as insecurity, a weakness I needed to outgrow. So I pushed forward. The environment I moved in became more transactional. People spoke in coded language, rarely naming what was actually being exchanged. Time, attention, discretion, presence. Everything had value, even if it wasn't labeled with a price. I learned to read those signals quickly. Who expected nothing? Who expected everything? Who wanted proximity without responsibility? It wasn't prostitution in the way people imagine it. It was more polished, more ambiguous. A performance of availability without explicit definition. I told myself that because nothing was ever said outright, I wasn't crossing the lines that scared me. That belief gave me a strange sense of moral distance, but my body knew the truth before my mind accepted it. I started feeling tense in situations that used to feel neutral, hyper-aware of how I was being perceived, of what was expected of me in any given room. I learned how to be charming without being open, attentive without being attached. I mastered the art of being present while staying emotionally elsewhere. That skill impressed people. It hollowed me out. The relationship with him grew darker as my outside world became more artificial. He thrived on the contrast, on knowing that he had access to parts of me no one else did, while simultaneously pushing me further into spaces where authenticity wasn't rewarded. He framed it as evolution, as shedding illusions. When I expressed discomfort, he reminded me that I was choosing this path, that empowerment meant owning my decisions, not retreating from them when they became uncomfortable. I nodded along, even when something inside me recoiled. I had stopped asking whether this was who I wanted to be. I was focused on whether I could continue being this version of myself without breaking. Sleep became irregular. My thoughts raced at night, replaying conversations, scanning for mistakes. I worried about being misunderstood, exposed, misread. I worried about losing control of a narrative I barely recognized anymore. And yet during the day, I moved with confidence. I looked composed, untouchable even. People admired my self-assurance. They told me I seemed fearless. They didn't see the cost. There were moments of clarity, brief flashes where I saw the entire structure for what it was. A life built on adaptation, not alignment. On performance, not presence. Those moments scared me more than anything else, because they threatened to dismantle the logic I had been using to survive. So I learned to suppress them. I convinced myself that discomfort was temporary, that once I reached a certain level of stability, everything would settle, that the chaos was just a phase, a transition into something better. I didn't yet understand that some paths don't lead forward, they just lead deeper. The more I adapted, the less room there was for hesitation. I learned that uncertainty made people uncomfortable, so I stopped showing it. I smiled when I wasn't sure. I nodded when I wanted to ask questions. I agreed before I fully understood what I was agreeing to. That kind of compliance was rewarded quickly. Doors opened, access was granted, approval followed. On the surface, it looked like success. I started receiving attention in ways that felt both flattering and unsettling. People were generous with compliments, with opportunities, with invitations that came wrapped in vague expectations. Everything remained unspoken, which somehow made it feel safer. As long as nothing was named, I could pretend nothing was real. He watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. He never needed to guide me anymore. I had learned the patterns. I knew how to move, how to respond, how to avoid conflict. When he did intervene, it was subtle, a raised eyebrow, a well-timed comment, a reminder of how easily things could be taken away. I told myself this was partnership, that we were navigating a complex world together, that the tension between us was just intensity, not control. But the volatility escalated. His approval became unpredictable. Affection arrived without warning and disappeared just as quickly. I found myself constantly recalibrating, trying to anticipate what version of him I would get, the loving one, the distant one, the critical one who dissected my behavior with surgical precision. Each time I tried to assert myself, it backfired. He framed my resistance as ingratitude, my discomfort as immaturity, my questions as proof that I wasn't as evolved as I claimed to be. Eventually, I stopped pushing back. It was easier to adjust than to argue. The nights became heavier. I lay awake, replaying moments that felt slightly off, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. I told myself I was lucky, that many people would envy my life, that the discomfort was simply the price of ambition. Still, something inside me kept pulling away. I started noticing how empty my conversations felt when I wasn't performing, how shallow my connections had become, how little anyone actually knew about me anymore. I had become a version of myself that was easy to consume but difficult to reach. There were moments when I missed simplicity, ordinary affection, being wanted without conditions. Those thoughts felt dangerous, so I pushed them down quickly. Nostalgia had no place in the world I was trying to survive. The irony was that I had never felt more visible, yet more invisible at the same time. People saw me constantly, but no one really saw me. Not the confusion, not the exhaustion, not the quiet dread that settled in my chest whenever I imagined this life continuing indefinitely. I began to sense that I was approaching a limit, not externally, but internally, a point where adaptation would no longer be enough, where something would have to give. I didn't know what that something would be. I only knew that the version of myself I had become was starting to feel unfamiliar, even to me. And once that awareness takes root, it never stays quiet for long.